I'm Amanda Knox, and you're listening to Hard Knocks. Welcome to yet another episode of Hard Knocks. Today I talk with Laura Porter, who is the executive director of the U.S. campaign to end the death penalty. So that means we're going to be talking about the death penalty today. Trigger warning, we talk about a lot of hard issues, including violence and the lasting impact that it has on victims. Prior to Laura's campaign work, she was a public defender for 12 years in New York. She was a legal analyst on television. She has led national efforts to end capital punishment since 2018. And she is now, leading this coalition of 50 plus organizations on a coordinated strategy to end the use of the capital punishment once and for all here in the United States. So we talk about that campaign, we talk about that effort, and we talk a lot just about where people's emotional and cultural attachment to death as punishment is coming from and legitimizing it in a way, while also addressing what she believes are the false advertisements of the death penalty to those of us who are afraid of violence and justifiably afraid of violence and want the state to do something about it. Enjoy. Welcome to Hard Knocks, Miss Laura Porter. Is it Dr. Laura Porter? What actually is your full legal name?
It's just Laura Porter.
Laura Porter, the Laura Porter. How about that? So I'm really excited to have this conversation and discuss all the nuances in what amounts to the death penalty. And you have worked in the past with the Eighth Amendment Project. And for those who are not caught up on their amendments, that is the amendment against cruel and unusual punishment. You're now working on the U.S. campaign to end the death penalty. Is that an extension of the Eighth Amendment Project? Is that a reimagining, or is it a completely different thing?
It is an extension, and a little bit of a reimagining too, in terms of 50 organizations nationwide had been working collaboratively to move the country further away from the death penalty, but we decided to announce it to the world that we're all working together, and that's what the U.S. campaign to end the death penalty is.
Great. And when did that start?
That just started this past December. We debuted in December.
Oh, congratulations.
But the organizations have been working together for decades. Mm-hmm. But we decided to announce to the world this collaboration and this national strategy to move the country away from the death penalty publicly in December.
So I'm not going to stay too much on you personally because I do want to get into this big issue, but I am curious, what is it that led you first to question the death penalty?
I think, that's a great question. One is, as a child, I grew up in the aftermath of the Holocaust. I just turned 62 this week, and so I always had a very strong visceral reaction and fear of state killing and state power. And then I became a public defender, and I worked in the legal system, and I saw flaws and issues, despite some good sides to the legal system as well. But I saw the flaws, and it really only just exacerbated my concern about the power of the state to kill.
So I think a lot of Americans would like to imagine themselves to not be Nazis and not participating in the kind of state killing that the Nazis committed. But what flaws have you seen in the system that has led you to question the way that the United States exercises the government right to murder people?
I would argue that any system run by human beings is going to have flaws because people are fallible. And this is a system that can only work with the participation of human beings. And so politics could enter it in, or bias or mistakes. Human beings make mistakes in terms of accuracy, fairness. And so there are so many things that can go wrong that I think that the state should not have the ultimate power to kill.
Mm-hmm. In the past, you've talked about how there seems to be a kind of cultural I don't know, like some states just have like a cultural affinity with the, or like it's like the idea that some people or some states really feel like an attachment, a cultural attachment to the death penalty as punishment. Where is that coming from?
I think it comes from a variety of sources historically, but I think a huge driving factor is slavery, lynching, racial terror, and the death penalty. That's not the only driving factor, but a very big one, which is why a lot of the use of the death penalty is concentrated in states that were the last to eliminate slavery, and that had histories of racial terror in their states. That I don't think that's the only driving factor, but that's the one kind of like historically that has built in those states a very strong cultural attachment to the death penalty
Huh.
that is taking longer to kind of move away from than other states who have less of a cultural attachment to the death penalty.
That's really interesting. Like it doesn't seem like it's a coincidence that the ones that were the least likely to get rid of slavery are also the least likely to get rid of the death penalty.
That's right. And, I think that I took a class when I was in college around crime statistics and their use. And throughout time, and what I learned in that class is if you look historically throughout time, that crime statistics have not changed that dramatically in terms of like the levels of crime and particularly violent crime throughout kind of like history. But what has changed is the way people perceive that danger, right? And that is often as it can be politicized or it can be used for certain goals. And so that feeds into it as well. And so I think that we right now we're in a period of where the country is the dominant political rhetoric is a tough on crime and a fear of crime. A few years ago there seemed to be a trajectory leaning towards more like we need to reform this huge criminal legal system that is imprisoning so many people. And so it does swing back and forth. But what I had learned from my college days is that that's just almost like an interpretation, but that the levels of crime do not go up and down like people think.
Right, right. I want to get to, I really want to try to get into the mindset of the person who deeply feels that the death penalty is justified and is therefore just. Because I have to say, just me personally, I don't think I've ever thought of the death penalty as being a good thing. Even before my whole experience of wrongful conviction abroad, all of that, I think that I was just raised in a family. Like I remember having one conversation, or not even a conversation, it was more like overhearing my mom talking about a case that was in the news. And I have no idea what the case was. I'm sure it was some person who murdered their family or something like that. And I remember my mom saying that person should have to spend the rest of their life in prison. And interestingly, she said, with pictures of the family members that they murdered around them in their cell. Like that's how my mom sort of interpreted the horror of a horrific crime and like what a just punishment would be just in her brain. And I remember distinctly that my mom was talking about that because people were saying that that person should get the death penalty. And my mom said, well, that's not the appropriate punishment. So that was like the first time I had ever heard anyone in my orbit discuss that. And it seemed like I absorbed that and I intuited from that what my mom was communicating was that people, like in a weird way, what she was suggesting is that people who get put to death actually don't end up facing the consequences of their actions. They just are like erased. And on the one hand, that was a horror in and of itself because the government shouldn't have the right to erase people from existence. And on the other hand, it was this deep felt desire that somebody should see consequences for a terrible action. And then as I've gone, through my own journey, through the criminal justice system and having been exposed to it the way that I have, I'm more deeply informed by how the government gets it wrong and how people are wrong about a lot of things and turn stories around crime into black and white narratives. And so that deeply informs my really definitive anti-death penalty position. I just don't believe that anyone should have the right to kill anyone. That is just not something that we can trust the state to impose upon people. But for a lot of people, there is this deeply felt sense that if you kill someone, you forfeit your right to life. Why doesn't that make sense?
So I think there's so many factors that go into our responses in society to crime and to violence. And what I think frustrates me so much is that keeping the focus entirely on what to do after the crime has been committed and to the person who committed the crime kind of relieves us all of worrying about, well, how could we have prevented this crime to begin with, which is much harder and deeper issues and policy changes and things that that we would need to address. And it's a visceral, and I understand the desire and the visceral need to have a very big response to horrible violence, and that throughout history human beings are capable of very horrible violence for a variety of reasons. Some of them have to do with severe mental illness, traumatize, victimize themselves, intellectual disability, things that feed into someone's social history. But I think that the response at the time of the crime is people just are in the aftermath and when emotions are most raw are looking for an answer. And right. An answer is like you're naming is we would want, and I think it puts victim family members through a very unfair analysis and process. So they are put in a position that if we want to honor how awful this loss was, and the best that we can offer you is to pursue an execution, as opposed to backing up and saying what could society have done to prevent this to begin with? Are there strategies that we're not trying or investing in? And then also, but they don't tell victim family members that they are actually about to enter a multi-decade long process that they don't know what the result will actually be. They may be pursuing a death sentence. Will that ever be carried out? And that's kind of almost a false advertisement to victims. Mm-hmm. And so many victims that we work with in our efforts to educate community members about the death penalty are very, very clear and say that this process is harmful to us, the long death penalty process. And then it is just to recognize, if you look at the death rows and who is sitting on death row, the vulnerabilities of the people who are sentenced to death and sitting there, and what are their social histories and what they've experienced in their life. And I know that a lot of someone who would feel differently might say, well, there's a lot of people who have very, very challenging and hard things in their life and they don't end up killing people. But it is not coincidental that the people who are sentenced to death have suffered extreme trauma in their lives, and like I said, some have severe mental illness, and these things had not been addressed in the years that they were growing up and preceding the crime.
Is there a sense that the death penalty, is part of the false advertising of the death penalty that it puts the fear of death in people who might commit a heinous crime?
Yeah, I mean, that the deterrence argument is one that death penalty proponents make. I think, and we get this a lot from law enforcement. A lot of people feel like that has been debunked. There's certainly been the National Academy of Sciences, there's been a lot of research on, is the death penalty an effective deterrent? And there's been studies across the spectrum on that, but the ones that are most validated using valid scientific methods have not shown the death penalty to impact crime one way or the other. So I don't want to say that it's definitely not a deterrent. It almost doesn't have, because the people who end up charged with capital crimes are not are not thinking that this is going to be a reality for them.
Right. They're not thinking rationally, they're not doing the calculus as they're committing the crime. And that's
Right.
kind of the point.
Right, that's right. And I think that we do a lot of outreach to law enforcement, and some law enforcement support the death penalty as a punitive measure, but they would tell you they don't think it's a deterrent.
Got it.
So this is really interesting.
So it goes back to that sort of moral clarity then. Is that what people who are proponents for the death penalty are actually looking for psychologically, some kind of moral clarity, like an eye for
Yeah,
an
I
eye?
think understandably people want a response to horrible things that feels like you're taking action and feels like you are naming the intensity and the harm caused by the violence. And so to me, like that's an easier one than, like I said, and then understanding the underlying causes and addressing the underlying causes. But the reality is, if it's not a deterrent, if it puts the victims through a decades long uncertain process and in many ways re-traumatizes victims through this long process, it didn't prevent the crime to begin with. It's not really healing or helping in the so it can lose its value over time.
What is it about, like, why is it that proponents of the death penalty, why isn't it enough to put someone in prison for the rest of their life, for instance? What's that extra cherry on top of the death penalty that motivates that clinging, that attachment to it?
Yeah, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I do think, again, it's a response in the aftermath of the violence. And as you know, the death penalty takes 20 years or 30 years to carry out. So it's interesting because the decision about seeking the death sentence, the giving of the death sentence, is all in the aftermath of the harm being caused, where emotions are highest and the harm is so visceral and strong and feeling. And so I think, again, like it's just a desire to have concrete action that names how bad the harm that was caused is, and then real harm is caused for sure. I
Yeah.
would argue this is not an effective response, that there could be more effective responses.
Yeah. No, I'm trying to play devil's advocate here and try to get into the mindset because, like, the counter argument that somebody who's very pro death penalty might say is, it's not the death penalty isn't the problem, it's the fact that it takes so long to carry it out. So we should actually make sure that we can carry it out sooner. Why not just carry it out the day that he gets sentenced, and then the family doesn't have to worry about it? What would you respond to that? Is it the closure aspect? Like, what is it that people are
Well,
looking
I,
for?
I would argue that's where the death penalty policy is an unanswerable conundrum. And that's because we want to try to make it fair and accurate. And that involves a long and drawn out system. A long and drawn out system is certainly not a deterrent, and it puts victims' families through decades of uncertainty. And because human beings are fallible, we can't do the 1 day version. And so there's, like, in my opinion, there's no answer that makes the death penalty work.
Right, totally. Um, I'm looking at, like, I'm thinking about this in terms of, like, trying to understand where people's feelings of this punitive nature come from. And I'm wondering if maybe it's a story, it's about storytelling. And I was wondering if I could talk to you just about what role does storytelling in news and politics and media play in sustaining the death penalty or in justifying it?
Well, you could take recent examples of horrible publicized murders, and you know people even who don't know the person who was murdered feel sad and horrified when violence happens. It makes it scary, and you wonder, could it happen in your own family to you? To you, it makes you feel unsafe and uncertain about our society. And so I think that that giving voice I believe in giving voice to harm, though. That's why I want to be clear. Like, I believe those stories should be told. I want a dialogue about what can we do about it? Like, what is an effective response to violence? How do we help those harmed in a very meaningful way? And also ideally, how do we prevent harm going forward? But when the harm has occurred, what is most helpful to people who are harmed? I would argue the death penalty is not that helpful.
Right.
It may serve some solace for some people, for sure, but in terms of what is help in healing and harm and in the needs in the aftermath of violence, I don't see the death penalty offering very much.
Yeah. In the past interviews that I've read of yours, you've said that we've been stuck in the wrong conversation in the United States. And that conversation is, what do we do to the person who committed the crime? And you've advocated for what you're saying now, which is instead a conversation around how do we help the people who have been harmed? How do we prevent harm going forward? And how do we hold people who committed crimes accountable, but in a productive and meaningful way? And I want to like unpack each of those questions. So the first being, how do we help people who have been harmed? You've been working in the criminal justice system for a long time, and the death penalty is often framed, and as you've said, falsely advertised as providing closure for victims' families. You've seen that that's not actually the case, because it's a decades-long process of putting families through this uncertainty. But ultimately, what have you seen actually helps people? What measures actually do help victims to find closure and healing in the aftermath of crimes that have happened? And also, to be clear, this is, how do we heal the people who have survived crimes? Because there are those who don't survive crimes. And I think that's the sticky wicket of it all, is there's nothing we as a society can actually do to undo the harm that was done. So maybe that's what the first question that we can get into is, what have you seen in your work has actually helped heal people, and what about those victims that can't be healed?
Yeah, that's a heavy and difficult question. I think that what I've learned in working with people who have had loved ones murdered now for 2 decades is that I've learned from many people that closure is a myth. There's kind of like before the harm your life, and there's the after, right? And that there's no kind of independent act or outside thing that can happen that will then make you whole again, or and so that even the idea of closure is maybe not an attainable goal. But there is a goal of healing and of support. And I think for every person who's experienced violence, that's going to look different. So I don't think there is one prescribed answer that, if only we did this, that will help. That's not the case. But I've seen certain strategies, whether they're restorative structures, where they can process things and be heard, to people who caused harm, where they get support from other people who have experienced similar harm, whether they get even help with resources if they are in need in the aftermath of violence, and having transparency about what is happening in the legal system that accompanies the violence. All of those things are part of healing.
And I imagine that preventing similar harms moving forward is one of those ways that we can heal. I know that no one can give me back the years that I spent wrongly imprisoned, but I spend a lot of time thinking about how we could make a justice system that would prevent someone from going through what I went through. And that gives me a sense of peace, and what I went through was not for nothing, right? As someone who has been harmed, I know that you can't take the harm away, but you can make it for something. And making it for something might be preventing a bad thing from happening again in the future. So what does prevent, if the death penalty doesn't prevent murder and horrific crimes from happening, what does?
Yeah, and I think that there has been an explosion probably over the last 2 decades of evidence-based violence prevention work in communities and programs. What is troubling and tough is that it takes concerted and long-term effort, like to really have an impact. Newark, New Jersey is an example where the community, the mayor's office, the police, everyone worked together to say, we are going to together work on lowering the amount of violence in the community. And it was effective because it was long term, it was comprehensive, it's something every day that you kind of like changing the way we do things permanently and looking at the systems that we have, looking at community needs that we have, looking at all of the types of things where if everyone worked together, you could effectively impact the amount of violence in the community. And it worked. And what's hard is that this has been replicated in numbers of places across the country, but it does involve continuing investment in resources. And I think we as a society have to figure out, do we want to, I would say it's like, let's take the, billions of dollars we've invested in the death penalty, which I think is an ineffective response to violence, and let's reinvest it in evidence-based community strategies that are working. And, I think that, like I said, with every individual victim experience, there's going to be different needs and different ways that will help them heal. But there are a lot of evidence-based strategies, particularly at the community level, that are working, but they don't have consistent investment, and that's a problem.
Can you describe some of those efforts? Because I do think that people have a hard time wrapping their mind around the idea that any sort of soft community efforts could actually have an impact. Because I think a lot of people genuinely believe that there are just good people and there are bad people in the world, and we don't really understand why people do horrible things. I mean, I think there is some acknowledgement in general that some people have bad backgrounds or some people are mentally ill, but ultimately we don't live in a world of Minority Report where we can predict when somebody is going to make a terrible choice and commit violence against another human being. And so there is a justified fear that we can't predict it. So how could we prevent it? And I'm curious to know what have you seen in this evidence-based prevention work that would alleviate some people's fears about that?
Sure. And so I'm explaining what I have learned from these programs, and I just don't want to be speaking, as an expert because they're the ones doing the work. But I've just been it's such an important piece, I think, of what I'm trying to do, which is end what I think is an ineffective.
Right. You have to give an alternative.
Right. So I want to be able to articulate, hopefully well, but even though I don't do the work, about programs that are successful. And what's interesting about you saying you can't predict, I think that folks in the field doing this work actually say you can predict a little bit. You can predict an at-risk community members. And again, this is very community focused, right? And where kind of police are involved, community groups and advocates, violence interrupters are involved, school systems, hospitals, everyone is working together on a unified violence reduction program that they understand trauma and how, trauma plays a big role in violence, right? And so getting to trauma and treating trauma early on is known to prevent violence, but it goes even further, is recognizing who are the folks in a community who are most at risk of either being victimized or being someone who is a perpetrator of violence, and going in there and starting to address needs from the beginning. And it sounds almost so out there and so difficult that it doesn't feel real, but it is real. Like, and there's reports, and there's data, there's independent evaluations of these programs, because they only are going to be valuable if we can really show that they're working, and also that people understand that they really are working. And I would say Newark is, there's several of them. There's some in California, there's some in Louisiana. They're all over the place. The Newark has a very extensive report that has been covered about like how is this working, and it's been sustaining itself. And that's but it does require that comprehensive approach, and the willingness to have that so schools are involved, hospitals are involved, police are involved, community groups are involved, all working together with a violence reduction agenda that is all complements each other.
Okay. Does that violence prevention effort, does it require a kind of monitoring, or how does it, or I mean, I guess you're not a super an expert in this, but I'm just curious personally, because the person who committed the crime against my roommate that ultimately sent me to prison, so I was being held accountable for his violent crimes. Like, this wasn't the first time that he had committed a crime. It was the first time that he had committed a murder, as far as we know. But he had a history of like escalating criminality. He was a little bit spiraling, like he was breaking and entering into people's homes. He was carrying a knife around with him. So there was like, it seems like somehow this person just like slipped through the fingers or the attention of law enforcement. And like a question that I have had, and that a lot of people have had, was why was he able to commit this crime when 5 days earlier he had been arrested for a previous crime? And I'm curious to know, like, I think some of the pushback recently on criminal justice related reforms has been kind of alerting this question. Well, we're not putting as many people in prison for the lesser crimes, and as a result, they're going out and escalating crimes, and now there's even more violence. Is that an accurate take, or what is the relation? Like, how does this violence prevention interact with like liberal criminal justice policies that are also intended to reduce mass incarceration?
Yeah, and I think I don't want to profess to have a clear answer because it's so broad, right? It's such a big topic, and the nature of violence in human beings, is as old as time. But I do think like one of the things you named is like what. I'll give you an example that comes to mind from what you just shared with me. Florida currently is on a very high execution pace that is unprecedented historically. They are just executing people almost every week, but not every week, at a pace that has never been seen before. And it came out this year that a number of these people who have been executed, not all, but a group of them, were incarcerated in an infamous juvenile justice facility, Dozier, in Florida, where the abuse was so severe that it makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Is very, very gruesome abuse of children who were sent to this facility. And there's a number of reasons which people can lead to committing a capital crime, but it is not also, like you were saying, it's not coincidental that there you had someone who had been in touch and brought into the criminal juvenile system, right? And that now a bunch of them are on death row who were abused in this system. And so I think that like we need to, like, that's why I want to constantly be asking different conversations, and we're asking like, what are we doing? And I think it is impacted by the broader criminal legal system. By the time a capital crime is committed, it's obviously way too late, to kind of like think about, but what are we doing with children who are brought into the criminal legal system? What are we doing? What do we know about ACEs and the trauma, the impact of trauma. What do we do? All of these things, and I don't want to make it like so overwhelming that then it is not worth trying new things, because I think if we don't ask ourselves those questions, we won't make headway, and we will just continue to have a responsive response to violence, which is after it occurred, what are we going to do to the person? But that doesn't help those harmed by violence, right? So yeah. I don't know if that answered your question, but it just brought to mind.
I mean, I think I'm asking, the question specifically that I'm asking is, with violence prevention, I'm just like, I'm thinking about what would have prevented the murder of my roommate, right? Mm-hmm. And one thing that would have prevented it was the person who committed this crime, when he was arrested 5 days earlier, not being immediately released to go on to commit a violent crime.
Right.
And, it seemed like the violence prevention, whatever that was just non-existent in that scenario, where like there's a known person who is committing starting out by committing petty crimes, but escalating, hasn't harmed anyone yet, but then goes on to harm somebody. Mm-hmm. Like, I think that a lot of liberal policies that I'm, a proponent of don't have a good question, or don't answer the question well enough of how do we identify the kinds of people who are likely to commit crimes and prevent them from doing so without just mass incarceration.
Yeah, and I think it's, and nor do I have a good answer for you because it's such a big problem. But what I can say is that even in the case that you're naming, my guess is that person had come in contact with numerous state institutions, and that those warning signs were there. And I know that from other experience in the criminal legal system, and so that are these state institutions, if they exist, right? They exist to like address issues. Are they addressing them in the most effective way? And each one you could look at, like, did the criminal system address at the earlier phases of wrongdoing? Were they asking the right questions? Were schools asking the right questions? Were any other state systems that came into it? And then also there is personal responsibility. There's family responsibility. There's all, community responsibility about kind of like how are we dealing when we see these issues. And so I think it's, you could have a widespread look at the problems, but what you're naming here is that there's multiple occasions to see something that is going in the wrong direction, and why was it never addressed?
Right.
And I think those are really, really important questions. And I think, as someone who doesn't believe that the carceral system is the answer to it all, it's not. I do believe in accountability, and I do believe at times the carceral system, at least for a period of time, is the appropriate place to kind of like readjust, and to like, so I don't, so it's just kind of like, it's very, very difficult to figure out how as a society we can prevent these things through a systemic approach. But I believe we can do more than we're doing.
Yeah.
Because we're always reacting after. Right.
Yeah. And I the thing I find so frustrating about the death penalty myself personally is that it seems like it's this sort of consolation prize that we dangle in front of the populace to say, oh, but look, if you commit the crime, you're going to meet the ultimate punishment. And that doesn't give me any kind of solace because it doesn't prevent the crime from happening in the first place. And so I'm more interested just as a citizen who is afraid of being hurt by another citizen, like, I don't want to wait until the bad thing has happened for the state to do something about it. And that's where I feel like the death penalty is this, like, again, this false advertisement of, oh, this is how we're meting out justice. And it's like, that's not what I want. I want to be safe. I don't want someone else to be not safe. Like, that doesn't seem like justice to me. So to that end, about holding people accountable for the crimes that they've committed. What does it mean to do that in a productive and meaningful way? If it is not simply to say, you've committed this crime, you have forfeited your right to be among us.
I think that we need to create more spaces for restorative processes, because restorative processes in their fundamental value is acknowledging accountability and harm that was committed. And I think that we don't create that. Like in some ways, I feel like by just imposing the punishment, it almost takes away the accountability piece, because something is being done to that person rather than them kind of coming to terms with harm that they have created. And so I feel like even if I think many people in our society will disagree in terms of the amount of how important is incarceration, how long it should be. That conversation is less interesting to me than providing opportunities for restorative processes, which involves taking accountability. And obviously in smaller crimes, that can look in a lot of different ways in terms of healing and taking accountability and making amends. In violence, it looks very, very different. But, I have worked a lot with some victim family members who went through restorative processes for murders. For them, that was an important piece for them to be able to go through that process with the person who committed the harm. Other people may not want that, but I feel like offering those spaces and having them is a piece that is missing in our criminal legal system.
I mean, offering someone who has committed a crime the opportunity to make amends and acknowledge the harm that they have done, you can give that person the opportunity, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily will take that opportunity.
That's right.
Right? And I wonder if the punitive attitude is one in which it's not about opportunity. It's about just like whether you are willing to take accountability or not, you are facing consequences. Is that a defeatist attitude? And is it, I mean, because, it is true. Like, what do we do about the fact that there are some people who commit crimes and just refuse to take responsibility for it, even when there's no question, or even when they've committed the crime and they have no regrets about it, fully own it, there's no problem with it. Like, what do you do about those people? Like, how do we as a society how is a victim supposed to respond to the kind of person who doesn't take up that opportunity to hold themselves accountable and make amends?
Well, most victims don't get that opportunity at all to even explore it. So it's not really something, and they have to, obviously, they're the decision makers about do they want to do that. But I think that there will always be, for a variety of reasons, people who are incapable of doing that, either through choice or through severe mental illness or through whatever the reasons. And again, there's no easy answer. There just isn't an easy answer. And what is somebody's victim's perspective path through healing is it probably needs to be multifaceted, and that the healing comes from a lot of different places and a lot of different pieces, so that if one isn't successful, they have other things that add to their healing is what I would say. Because I don't think, like you're saying, there are people who that process would never be effective or helpful.
What part of that healing process is the state's responsibility?
I feel like the state should have a much bigger responsibility in the healing process. Again, because if you were to say, well, what is the state's responsibility? They are spending millions and millions and millions of dollars and in an approach that is very, very expensive that I believe does not impacting healing. So it is a choice. It's a choice of resources. It's a choice. There's some of the work in the states that we work and partner with. So, for instance, in Tennessee, the Tennessee organization that's working to end the death penalty has also a mission to help people harmed by violence. And so, one of the things that they did is they passed a law that changed the approach that the state was taking in divvying out resources for victims, particularly in the aftermath of violence, for funeral expenses and for things like that. And because everyone who used to apply would get denied. 60% of the people who applied for state resources for help in the aftermath of violence were denied, and it's because they had crazy requirements that made it impossible. And so, the death penalty group that we work with in Tennessee also takes on this issue and worked with victims across the state who may not have all agreed with their position on the death penalty, but did agree that more victims should have access to resources. And these were resources that were already there. They weren't even necessarily getting more, but they just weren't getting access to it. And so there's a lot more. Every state has issues like that.
That's super interesting. So as much as there is continued resistance, one thing that I've heard you say is that when you first started doing this work, the idea of ending the death penalty was extremely controversial, that anyone who was going in for elected office would only get elected if they took a pro-penalty stance, but that is changing or has been changing. That the idea of eliminating the death penalty, recognizing that it's ineffective and cruel and unusual, is more mainstream. To what do you attribute that shift in our cultural attachment to the death penalty?
I think it's a variety of factors. I would say the number one leading factor is the understanding by more and more Americans that the system can make a mistake and actually convict someone wrongfully. I can't overestimate the impact that understanding has changed on support for the death penalty. But I do think there's other factors as well. I think that particularly decision makers and legislators are willing to look at that, whatever the party they're from, and they're going to look at like, what bang are we getting for our buck? And so we have a system that we know makes mistakes. We know it harms victims. We know it sometimes is subject to bias, politics. It is a system run by human beings that's fallible, and we're spending a lot of money on it. It then starts to lose its allure, And so I do think that it is very that this issue is spreading it. And what makes me most hopeful is that the most recent Gallup poll, and Gallup polls on the death penalty every year, has more people opposed to the death penalty than supporting the death penalty age 55 and under. So it does feel like, this work is slower than I would like it to be, but there is an understanding that theoretically maybe you could support the idea of punishment, or just because of that understandable human response to want to address a violent crime, but that this policy as a policy is not very effective in how it's carried out. So, I mean, we have a lot of people from the right side of the political spectrum come in for small government perspective, that they don't trust government to fix a pothole, but
Right.
should we trust them to make a life or death decision accurately and fairly? So they do question government more easily. We have a lot of people on the right come in from a pro-life perspective, that they are now linking on their pro-life agenda the death penalty. So it's just very interesting that the trajectory is changing. Even during this tough time, it's still changing. Right.
Yeah. I've always found it interesting that the more conservative perspective on this wasn't more rooted in both that libertarian stance of that you don't tread on me except for the right to murder people. Like that seems really counterintuitive, that like, oh, we can't trust the government to do anything except kill people. And then the other stance being from a more religious conservative space. Why hasn't there been more of resistance to the idea of the state committing committing someone to death when there is a sacredness, there is something sacred about a human life. So I'm glad that that's coming more into clarity for the states that have had more of a cultural attachment to the death penalty. That said, are you seeing that there is more of a swing back happening with the current administration?
Well, the current administration is very heavily promoting the use of the death penalty, and they are doing it both within the federal agenda in terms of trying to bring more death penalty cases, but also really, really pushing states at the local level to execute people and to expand the death penalty. So we
Why?
are definitely. I honestly don't know why, because I think that we are currently in a period where power and the authority of the state using that power in a way that impacts lives has an authoritarian feel to it, of course, and that and so it's across issues. It's not just the death penalty. It's what's happening on the streets. It's what's happening with suspected drug couriers in the sea. Like I think that the idea of state killing as a use of power and policy is a very important message from this current administration. I luckily I don't think that it is felt that much at the state level, and the death penalty mostly lives in the states. I think that there are people across the ideological spectrum whose job it is to really think about these issues, who are more persuaded by the problems that we have been discussing.
So how do you talk to, on the local level, at the state level, to people about shifting, like when it comes to the death penalty? I think one of the best arguments in favor of abolishing it is that our justice system should reflect our highest values, not our deepest fears, right? Mm-hmm. How do you talk to local government officials about that, and shifting how government reflects that, especially when it comes to this issue?
I think the most essential thing in doing work on the death penalty is to have no judgment for people who support the death penalty. That it is understandable, and a reaction to horrible crime is like, you can understand how people can have that perspective.
We all have that visceral feeling.
Yeah, and to acknowledge that harm is committed, and the impacts of violence are horrible, and so not being afraid of that topic. But I also, then it allows you to kind of explore. We together are acknowledging that harm and violence are awful, and we would like to reduce it, and we'd like to have responses that are meaningful. Then it allows you to find, that's common ground. Like, you're beginning with that common ground. We both share, like, we want a safe society. We want people to feel safe. We want to reduce harm. We want to help those harmed. We are all on the same side on those issues. And so then you can then get to kind of like, well, is this particular policy contributing to those shared values? And I think that's one way that is a really nice approach, because we want to have a credibility in caring about people harmed. And if we don't care about people harmed, why are we doing this work, right? And so I feel like that's the essential piece to get out. And then you can get into, like, is this policy an effective response to harm? And that's when we were naming all of the problems with it. And I think that when you get people to see that, and again, it's the fallibility of human beings and the mistakes and the problems that can happen, they may start to look for other solutions to have an impact on people who are harmed. And also, they may be willing to let go of something that is, in my opinion, clearly not working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I have to say, as someone who had a friend raped and murdered, the idea of that person who raped and murdered her being murdered himself gives me no feeling of solace. Mm-hmm. I do feel troubled that, prison itself wasn't enough, it seems, to change him or restore him in any positive way. He's never admitted to his crimes. He's never tried to make amends to the people that he's harmed. And he's now on trial again for sexually assaulting another young woman. So, since getting out of prison. And I wonder if, just me personally, as, what would you say to someone like me, who, the bad person who hurt my friend, and who then, I was held accountable for his crimes and he did nothing to stop it, who has gone on to commit more crimes? How would you, knowing that the death penalty doesn't give me any sense of comfort, what kind of comfort could the state offer someone like me?
Yeah. I think outside of the legal system are there resources available to help people heal through various different processes, through not just individual therapy, through community and sharing, and also not being afraid to acknowledge the harm and hear from people who are impacted by the harm what they think they need. I really think that needs to drive the conversation, is what do victims in the aftermath of violence and family members and friends, what do they need that they're not getting, and is this something that the state can help provide? And that's where I think we need to be digging into that more and more. Often politicians say they speak for victims, but in my experience, they don't really talk to the victims when they say they're speaking for victims. They acknowledge, of course, the horrible crimes, and so thus they think they're speaking for victims. But are they really speaking to victims about what are their biggest needs in the aftermath of violence, and what are the continuing needs, and are you getting those addressed? And so I can't speak to naming which specific ones people need, but our policies should be informed by the people who have the needs. And if we are only talking about the criminal legal system, we're leaving a whole bunch of questions unanswered and needs unmet, because that's only one piece of their journey in the aftermath of crime.
Okay. Let's see. Is there anything else that I haven't asked you that you'd like me to, or that you'd like to share about all this? Or has any of these questions sort of raised any thoughts or issues in your mind?
No, I appreciate the nuance and the willingness to dive into the difficult topics. I think violence is a very difficult topic. And I think doing the work, I hope to always do the work with humility, and to not be afraid of acknowledging harm, and that violence happens. And again, to build that common ground and say, I'd love to work with people who want to explore effective responses and more ideas and more things that can help. And I see the death penalty as violence as well. And so I don't want to respond with violence. And so I invite anyone to kind of learn more about the work that we do at the U.S. campaign and the death penalty, to get on our list and see if they're interested in hearing more about what the work looks like, because it is deeper than just the death penalty.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Laura Porter. It's been a great conversation. So thank you so much for being willing to go into the difficult topics with me. I think this is going to be really great for our listeners.
Thanks. I really appreciate you having me.
Of course. Take care.
Thanks.